The fluorescent light flickered overhead as Marcus Williams pulled another dusty box from the storage room shelf. 20 years had passed since he'd walked these halls as a student, and now here he was, back at Jefferson Elementary as the new principal, tasked with cleaning out decades of accumulated junk. At 38, Marcus carried himself with the quiet authority of a man who'd fought for every opportunity. His journey from the projects of East Cleveland to a master's degree in education hadn't been easy, and the cynicism of those struggles had long since replaced whatever faith he'd carried as a child sitting in his grandmother's Baptist church. The storage room smelled of old paper and forgotten dreams. Box after box contained outdated textbooks, broken classroom supplies, and files from teachers long retired or dead. Marcus was about to call it a day when his hand brushed against something wedged behind a filing cabinet, a slim leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth by countless hands. He opened it carefully, the binding creaking with age. The first page bore an inscription in careful script: Property of Samuel Washington, 1983-1984. Let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like a mighty stream. Amos 5:24. Marcus felt his breath catch. Samuel Washington. Mr. Washington, the teacher who had changed his life during 3rd grade, who had seen potential in an angry 8-year-old when no one else bothered to look. The man who had simply vanished one spring day in 1984, leaving behind only questions and a classroom full of confused children. He'd been told Mr. Washington had a breakdown, that he'd simply walked away from teaching, from Cleveland, from everything. There had been whispers among the adults, something about pressure, about him not fitting in, about it being better for everyone if certain things were left alone. Marcus had been too young to understand then, but old enough to feel the loss like a physical ache. Now, holding the journal in his hands, Marcus felt that old wound tear open. The official story had never sat right with him, even as a child. Mr. Washington wasn't the type to just disappear. He was the type to stay and fight, to protect his students no matter what. Marcus opened to a random page and began to read. October 15, 1983. Another meeting with Principal Hartley today. He made it clear that my methods are causing concern among certain parents. Apparently teaching these children about Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth alongside the standard curriculum is inappropriate and divisive. I asked him what was divisive about teaching American history. He couldn't give me an answer. I won't back down. These children deserve to know their heritage, their strength. They deserve to see themselves as more than what this neighborhood expects them to be. If that makes some people uncomfortable, so be it. Marcus turned the page, his hands trembling slightly. November 3rd, 1983. Found another threatening note in my desk today. This one more explicit than the others. Nigger teacher, know your place. I've reported it to Hartley, but he seems more concerned about keeping things quiet than finding who's responsible. Officer Bradley was here again today, lurking around during my lunch break. Something isn't right. The journal slipped from Marcus's suddenly nerveless fingers. Threatening notes. Police surveillance. This wasn't the story he'd been told as a child. This was something else entirely, something darker and more deliberate. He gathered up the journal in several boxes, his mind racing. Whatever had happened to Samuel Washington, the truth had been buried along with the man. But Marcus was no longer the powerless 8-year-old who had watched his favorite teacher disappear. He was a grown man with resources, connections, and most importantly, a burning need to know the truth. As he locked the storage room behind him, Marcus made a silent promise to the memory of the teacher who had believed in him when no one else would. He would find out what really happened to Samuel Washington, no matter how deep he had to dig or how many people preferred the truth to stay buried. The hallway stretched before him, empty and echoing with the ghosts of children long grown. Somewhere in these walls lay the answers he sought, and somewhere Samuel Washington deserved justice at last. Pieces of the past. Detective Maria Santos had been expecting Marcus's call. Word traveled fast in Cleveland's educational circles, and the discovery of Samuel Washington's journal had already made its way through the network of teachers, administrators, and retired staff who remembered the quiet scandal of 1984. She met Marcus at Arabica Coffee, a neutral spot away from the school where they could talk without drawing attention. At 45, Santos was a study in controlled intensity, her dark hair pulled back severely, her brown eyes missing nothing. She'd worked missing persons for 15 years, and the Washington case had always bothered her, even though it technically wasn't her case. It had been closed before she'd even made detective. "I remember him," she said, stirring her coffee slowly. "Not personally. I was still in uniform back then. But the case file crossed my desk a few years ago during a cold case review. Officially, Samuel Washington left town voluntarily. No evidence of foul play." Marcus slid the journal across the table. "Read this and tell me if you still think he left voluntarily." Santos opened the journal, her expression growing darker as she read. After several minutes, she looked up. "Where exactly did you find this?" "Storage room at Jefferson Elementary." "It was wedged behind a filing cabinet, like someone had tried to hide it but didn't want to destroy it entirely. Or like someone was interrupted while trying to dispose of evidence." Santos closed the journal carefully. "Mr. Williams, I need to be straight with you. This case was closed by people with a lot more authority than I have. If we start poking around, we're going to make enemies." "What kind of enemies?" Santos was quiet for a long moment, weighing her words. "The kind that made sure this journal disappeared in the first place. The kind that had enough pull to shut down an investigation before it really started." Marcus leaned forward. "Detective Santos, Samuel Washington was the first adult who ever made me believe I could be something other than a statistic. He saw potential in kids that the system had already written off. If someone hurt him because of that—" He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "I need to know what happened." Santos studied his face, seeing the determination there, the pain of old wounds. She'd worked enough cases to recognize when someone was willing to see things through to the end, regardless of the cost. "All right," she said finally. "But we do this quietly, and we do it carefully. The first thing we need is to talk to people who were there. Teachers, staff, anyone who might remember details that didn't make it into the official report." "I already have a list," Marcus said, pulling out a notebook. "My grandmother helped me compile it. She still goes to Mount Calvary Baptist, where a lot of the Jefferson staff attended church back then." "Good. We'll start there. But Marcus," Santos fixed him with a serious look, "promise me something. If this gets dangerous, and it might, you'll step back and let me handle it." Marcus nodded, but Santos could see in his eyes that it was a promise he wouldn't be able to keep. "Some cases got into your blood, became personal in ways that made objectivity impossible. The Washington case was clearly one of those for Marcus Williams." As they parted ways, Santos made a mental note to request the original case file. Officially, she was just following up on some loose ends. Unofficially, she was beginning to suspect that Samuel Washington's disappearance was connected to something much larger than one teacher's refusal to stay in his place. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot as Marcus drove toward Mount Calvary Baptist Church. His grandmother had arranged for him to meet with Ruth Henderson, who had been the secretary at Jefferson Elementary in 1984. If anyone remembered the details of those final weeks before Mr. Washington vanished, it would be her. Mount Calvary sat in the heart of what had once been a thriving African-American neighborhood, its brick facade weathered but dignified. Marcus hadn't set foot in a church since his grandmother's funeral 5 years earlier, and he felt the familiar knot of guilt and anger as he climbed the front steps. Ruth Henderson was waiting for him in the fellowship hall, a woman in her 70s with silver hair and sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She moved slowly but with purpose, setting out coffee and cookies as if they were old friends rather than strangers connected by a 20-year-old mystery. "I remember you," she said as Marcus sat down. "Little Marcus Williams, always getting into trouble until Mr. Washington took you under his wing." "Yes, ma'am. He made a difference in my life." Ruth's expression grew sad. "He made a difference in a lot of lives. That's what made what happened to him so wrong." "Mrs. Henderson, what exactly did happen?" "I've been told different stories over the years." Ruth was quiet for a long moment, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup. "Samuel Washington was a good man, Mr. Williams, a godly man who believed in doing right by those children. But there were people who didn't appreciate him stirring things up." "What kind of things?" "He was teaching those children about their history, their heritage. He was showing them that they could be more than what society expected. Some folks didn't like that, said he was filling their heads with ideas." Marcus leaned forward. "Who said that?" "Principal Hartley, for one. School board members. Some of the white parents whose children attended Jefferson." Ruth's voice grew harder. "And some of the black parents, too, I'm ashamed to say. People who thought it was better to keep quiet, not make waves." "What about the police?" "Detective Santos mentioned that there was some kind of surveillance." Ruth's eyes flashed with old anger. Officer Bradley. That man made Samuel's life hell those last few months. Would show up at the school, park outside Samuel's apartment, follow him to the grocery store. Said he was investigating reports of suspicious activity. Suspicious activity? Samuel was helping some of the older students with college applications. He was driving kids to libraries and museums on weekends. He was showing them a world beyond this neighborhood. Ruth shook her head. In some people's minds, that was suspicious enough. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. Mrs. Henderson, do you think Mr. Washington left voluntarily? Ruth Henderson looked him straight in the eye. Son, Samuel Washington would never have abandoned those children. Never. Whatever happened to him, it wasn't his choice. As Marcus left the church, Ruth's words echoed in his mind. Samuel Washington hadn't left voluntarily. Someone had made sure he disappeared, and someone had made sure the truth stayed buried. But truth had a way of surfacing, even after 20 years, and Marcus Williams was determined to help it see the light. Deeper currents. Father Michael O'Brien hadn't changed much in 20 years, though his red hair had gone gray and his face carried more lines. When Marcus found him at St. Augustine's Catholic Church, the priest was tending to a small garden behind the rectory, his hands black with soil. Marcus Williams, Father O'Brien said, looking up from the tomato plants. I heard you were back in the neighborhood. Principal at Jefferson now, isn't that right? Yes, Father. I was hoping we could talk about Samuel Washington. The priest's expression grew guarded. That's a name I haven't heard in a long time. I found his journal. It tells a different story than what we were told as children. Father O'Brien straightened slowly, wiping his hands on a cloth. Come inside. This isn't a conversation for the garden. The rectory was small and sparse, decorated with simple crosses and photographs of parish life spanning decades. Father O'Brien poured 2 glasses of iced tea and settled into a worn armchair across from Marcus. What exactly did you find in that journal? Marcus pulled out photocopies he'd made of key pages, threatening notes, mentions of police harassment, references to people wanting him to know his place. This doesn't sound like a man planning to leave voluntarily. Father O'Brien read in silence, his face growing pale. When he finished, he set the papers aside and stared out the window for a long moment. I should have done more, he said finally. What do you mean? Samuel came to see me in March of 1984. He was frightened, though he tried not to show it. He said he'd been getting anonymous threats, that someone had broken into his apartment and gone through his things. He asked if I thought he should go to the FBI. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. The FBI? Why would he want to involve federal agents? Because he suspected that local law enforcement was part of the problem. He'd documented several incidents of harassment by Officer Bradley, being pulled over for no reason, having his car searched, being questioned about his associates. Father O'Brien rubbed his forehead. Samuel thought it might be connected to civil rights investigations in the area. What kind of investigations? This was 1984, Marcus. The civil rights movement was still fresh in people's minds, and there were ongoing federal investigations into police brutality, discriminatory housing practices, educational segregation. Samuel thought someone might have mistaken his community work for something more politically threatening. Marcus tried to process this information. Did he contact the FBI? I don't know. He disappeared before we could talk again. Father O'Brien's voice was heavy with regret. I should have insisted he file a report immediately. I should have gone with him to the federal building myself. Father, who else knew about his concerns? I told him to talk to someone he trusted, someone who might be able to help or at least document what was happening. Who? Dr. Eleanor Hayes. She was a professor at Case Western, worked with the NAACP on educational issues. Samuel had met her through some workshop or conference. Father O'Brien paused. She might still be alive. She'd be in her 80s now, but she was a tough woman. If anyone would remember the details, it would be her. As Marcus left St. Augustine's, his phone buzzed with a text from Detective Santos. Found the original case file. Meet me at the station. You need to see this. Cleveland Police Headquarters hadn't improved with age. The building still smelled of industrial disinfectant and stale coffee, still echoed with the sounds of ringing phones and frustrated voices. Santos met Marcus in the lobby and led him to a small conference room where a thin manila folder lay open on the table. This is it? Marcus asked, staring at the meager collection of papers. This is the entire investigation into Samuel Washington's disappearance? Such as it was. Santos sat down heavily. 1 incident report, 2 witness statements, and a closure memo. The whole thing was wrapped up in less than a week. Marcus picked up the incident report, dated April 3, 1984. The narrative was brief and clinical. Subject Samuel Washington, age 31, reported missing by landlord after failing to pay rent and not responding to attempts at contact. Subject's apartment found in normal condition with no signs of struggle. Vehicle located at Cleveland Hopkins Airport, long-term parking. Investigation indicates subject departed voluntarily. This is it. This is the investigation. Gets better. Santos handed him the witness statements. Statement 1. Landlord says Washington was behind on rent and acting strange in recent weeks. Statement 2. Principal Hartley says Washington had been having difficulties and had mentioned wanting to leave teaching. Marcus looked up from the papers. What about the journal entries? What about the threatening notes he received? No mention of them anywhere in the file. What about his personal effects? His classroom materials? His car? Car was processed for prints and released to a salvage yard after 6 months. Personal effects. Santos flipped through the papers. No inventory list, no evidence log. Marcus felt a cold fury building in his chest. They didn't investigate. They didn't even pretend to investigate. Oh, it gets worse. Santos pulled out the closure memo, signed by Detective Lieutenant James Bradley. Look who closed the case. Marcus stared at the signature. Bradley. The same Officer Bradley mentioned in the journal. Same guy. He made lieutenant 6 months after the Washington case was closed. Retired in 1995 with full pension. Where is he now? Santos was quiet for a moment. Marcus, I need to tell you something. I've been doing some digging since we talked yesterday. James Bradley died in 2003. Apparent heart attack at age 58. Convenient. Maybe. But here's the interesting part. I talked to a retired detective who worked with Bradley. Guy named Tommy Kowalski. Decent cop who never liked Bradley much. He told me something interesting about the Washington case. Marcus waited. Bradley came back from the scene at Washington's apartment and told everyone the case was federal now. Said the FBI had jurisdiction and that local PD was to back off completely. But the file shows the case was closed locally. Exactly. Either Bradley was lying about federal involvement or, Santos paused, or the FBI was involved and the local closure was just a cover story. Santos nodded. I've put in a FOIA request for any federal files on Samuel Washington. It'll take weeks to get a response if we get one at all. Marcus stood and paced to the window, looking out at the city where Samuel Washington had lived and worked and vanished. Somewhere out there, people knew what had really happened. People who had kept quiet for 20 years, who had let a good man's memory be tarnished by lies and cover-ups. Detective Santos, what do you know about Dr. Eleanor Hayes? The civil rights lawyer? She's retired, lives in Shaker Heights. Why? Father O'Brien said Samuel was planning to contact her before he disappeared. If he did manage to talk to her, she might have information that never made it into any official file. Santos gathered up the papers. It's worth a shot. But Marcus, we need to be careful. The people who covered this up in 1984 might still be around, and they might not appreciate us digging up old secrets. As they left the police station, Marcus felt the weight of 20 years pressing down on him. Samuel Washington had been silenced, his story buried beneath lies and official indifference. But the truth had a way of persisting, of waiting for the right person to come along and drag it back into the light. Marcus Williams intended to be that person, whatever the cost. The professor's secret Dr. Eleanor Hayes lived in a Tudor-style house on a tree-lined street in Shaker Heights, the kind of neighborhood where professors and doctors and successful lawyers raised their children in quiet prosperity. At 82, she moved with a careful dignity, her white hair pulled back in an elegant bun, her dark eyes still sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. She invited Marcus and Detective Santos into a living room lined with books, the walls covered with photographs spanning decades of civil rights work. There was Dr. Hayes with Thurgood Marshall, with Julian Bond, with local activists whose faces Marcus didn't recognize but whose commitment showed in their eyes. Samuel Washington, Dr. Hayes said, settling into a leather armchair. Now there's a name I haven't spoken aloud in 20 years. Ma'am, we're trying to piece together what really happened to him, Marcus said. Father O'Brien mentioned that Samuel had planned to contact you before he disappeared. Dr. Hayes was quiet for a long moment, studying Marcus's face. You're one of his students, aren't you? I can see it in the way you carry yourself. Samuel had a gift for recognizing potential in young people. Yes, ma'am. He was my third-grade teacher. And now you're the principal at Jefferson Elementary. She smiled sadly. Samuel would be proud. He always said those children would grow up to change the world if someone just believed in them. Detective Santos leaned forward. Dr. Hayes, do you remember Samuel contacting you in 1984? Oh, yes. He called me in March, very agitated. Said he needed to talk to someone about harassment he was experiencing, possible civil rights violations. We arranged to meet the following week. Did the meeting take place? Dr. Hayes's expression grew troubled. No, Samuel never showed up. When I called the school, they told me he was no longer employed there. When I called his apartment, the phone was disconnected. Marcus felt his chest tighten. What exactly had he wanted to discuss? Dr. Hayes rose and walked to a filing cabinet in the corner of the room. She pulled out a thick folder and returned to her chair. I kept notes from our phone conversation. I kept notes from everything in those days. Occupational hazard. She opened the folder and pulled out several pages covered in neat handwriting. Samuel told me he was being harassed because of his involvement with something called the Jefferson Education Project. What was that? An informal program Samuel had started to help his students and their families navigate educational opportunities. He was tutoring children after school, helping parents understand their rights regarding special education services, organizing trips to colleges and museums. All volunteer work, all on his own time. Santos took notes as Dr. Hayes continued. But, according to Samuel, someone had decided this was more than just educational outreach. He'd been approached by FBI agents who questioned him about possible communist infiltration of the school system. Marcus stared at her. Communist infiltration? In 1984? You have to understand the times, young man. The Cold War was still very real, and there were people in government who saw communist conspiracies everywhere, especially in civil rights activities. Samuel said the agents seemed particularly interested in his contacts with community organizations, with parents who were asking questions about educational equity. Dr. Hayes turned to another page of notes. He also mentioned receiving threatening letters, having his apartment broken into, being followed by police officers. He was frightened, but more than that, he was angry. He said he wouldn't be intimidated into abandoning his students. Dr. Hayes, Santos said carefully, did Samuel mention any specific names? FBI agents, police officers, school officials? He mentioned a Detective Bradley who seemed to be coordinating the harassment, and there were school board members. She paused, consulting her notes. Robert Kellerman and Patricia Morrison. Samuel said they'd been pushing to have him removed from Jefferson. Marcus recognized the names. Kellerman had been a prominent local businessman. Morrison, the wife of a city councilman. Both had died years ago, taking their secrets to the grave. There's something else, Dr. Hayes said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. Samuel told me he'd been documenting everything, taking photographs, making copies of threatening letters, keeping detailed records of every incident of harassment. He said he had enough evidence to prove a conspiracy to violate his civil rights. Where would he have kept this evidence? He didn't say, but he was planning to bring it to our meeting. He said it was somewhere safe, somewhere his harassers wouldn't think to look. As they prepared to leave, Dr. Hayes walked them to the door. Mr. Williams, there's something you should know. After Samuel disappeared, I tried to follow up. I contacted the FBI field office, asked about the agents who had questioned him. They denied any knowledge of an investigation involving Samuel Washington or Jefferson Elementary. They denied it? Completely. Said there was no record of any communist infiltration investigation in the Cleveland school system. Either Samuel was lying, which I don't believe, or those agents weren't really FBI. As Marcus and Santos drove back toward downtown, they sat in contemplative silence. The picture emerging from their investigation was far more complex and sinister than either had imagined. Samuel Washington hadn't simply been harassed by racist neighbors or overzealous police. He'd been targeted by an organized conspiracy that involved fake federal agents, corrupt local officials, and a cover-up that reached into the highest levels of city government. We need to find that evidence, Santos said finally. If Samuel really documented everything, if it still exists somewhere, it's been 20 years. Where would you hide something for 20 years? Santos was quiet for a moment. Somewhere secure, somewhere personal, somewhere connected to what mattered most to him. Marcus thought about Samuel Washington, about the man who had believed in his students above all else, who had risked everything to give them a better future. The school? He said suddenly. He hit it at Jefferson Elementary. We already searched the storage room. Not all of it. There are areas of that building I haven't been in since I was a student. Old fallout shelters, unused classrooms, maintenance areas. Marcus felt a surge of excitement. If Samuel wanted to hide something where his harassers wouldn't think to look, where would be safer than the place they were trying to drive him away from? As they pulled into the Jefferson Elementary parking lot, Marcus felt the weight of history pressing down on him. Somewhere in this building, Samuel Washington had hidden the evidence that would expose his tormentors. Somewhere in these halls lay the truth that had been buried for 20 years. It was time to bring it back to the light. Hidden truth. The Jefferson Elementary building felt different at night. Without the voices of children echoing through the halls, without the bustle of teachers and staff, the old structure seemed to hold its breath, waiting for secrets to be revealed. Marcus used his master key to let Detective Santos into the building. They'd waited until after dark, not wanting to draw attention to their search. If Samuel Washington had hidden evidence somewhere in the school, they needed to find it before someone else realized what they were looking for. "Where do we start?" Santos asked, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness of the main hallway. "Basement level. There are areas down there that haven't been used in decades." Marcus led the way to a stairwell at the far end of the building. During the Cold War, they converted part of the basement into a fallout shelter. It's been sealed off since the 80s. They descended into the bowels of the building, their footsteps echoing off concrete walls. The basement smelled of dust and dampness, of decades of forgotten storage. Marcus led Santos past the modern utility rooms to a section where the hallway narrowed and the walls were made of older, rougher concrete. "Here," he said, stopping before a heavy wooden door marked with faded civil defense symbols. The door was secured with a rusty padlock that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. Santos examined the lock with her flashlight. "This isn't as old as it looks. See the scratches around the keyhole? Someone's opened this recently." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. "Recently? Within the last few years, I'd say. The rust is surface level, and there are fresh scratches in the metal." Santos pulled out a set of lockpicks. "One advantage of 20 years in law enforcement. You learn to open things." The lock clicked open after a few minutes of careful work. Marcus pulled the heavy door open, and they stepped into what had once been Cleveland's answer to nuclear war. The fallout shelter was a long, narrow room lined with concrete benches and equipped with old air filtration equipment. But what caught their attention immediately were the file boxes stacked along one wall, dozens of them, each labeled with dates from the 1980s. "Someone's been using this as storage," Santos said, approaching the boxes. "But not official school storage. Look at the labels." Marcus read the handwriting on the nearest box. "Jefferson Education Project. Student Files 1983-84. His hands trembling, he opened the box and found it filled with manila folders, each containing detailed records of individual students, test scores, family interviews, college preparation materials. "This is Samuel's work," Marcus said, his voice filled with awe. "The Jefferson Education Project. He documented everything he was doing for those kids." Santos had opened another box and was examining its contents. "Marcus, look at this." She held up a thick folder labeled Harassment Documentation. Inside were photocopies of threatening letters, photographs of Samuel's vandalized car, detailed logs of every incident of surveillance and intimidation he'd experienced. Marcus opened the folder and began reading. The documentation was meticulous and damning. Samuel had recorded license plate numbers of cars that followed him, names and badge numbers of officers who harassed him, dates and times of threatening phone calls. Most disturbing were the photographs, images of Samuel's apartment after break-ins, pictures of racist graffiti painted on his car, shots of men in suits watching his building. "Jesus," Santos whispered, looking over Marcus's shoulder. "He documented everything. This is enough evidence to bring down half the city government." Marcus turned to another section of the folder and froze. Staring back at him was a photograph of a man he recognized, Officer James Bradley, but standing next to him was someone Marcus hadn't expected to see. "Dr. Hayes was right," Marcus said, his voice tight with anger. "Look at this." The photograph showed Bradley talking to a man in a suit outside Jefferson Elementary. The man's face was clearly visible, and Marcus recognized him from old school board meetings he'd attended as a child. "Robert Kellerman," Santos said, reading the caption Samuel had written on the back of the photo. "School board member and known associate of Detective Bradley. photographed coordinating surveillance of Jefferson Elementary, March 15, 1984. They spent the next hour going through box after box of evidence. Samuel Washington had documented a conspiracy that reached from the school board to the police department to unnamed federal agencies. He'd identified a network of officials who had decided that his work with disadvantaged children posed some kind of threat to the established order. But it was in the last box that they found the most explosive evidence, a folder labeled Insurance Policy. Inside were copies of financial records showing bribes paid to school board members, photographs of police officers accepting envelopes of cash, and most damning of all, a confession letter from a man named David Murphy, identified as a private investigator hired to harass Samuel Washington. Marcus read Murphy's letter aloud. "I was hired by Robert Kellerman to make life difficult for the Washington guy. Nothing violent, just scare him enough to make him quit or transfer. But things got out of hand. Bradley was pushing for more aggressive action, and some of the other guys were talking about permanent solutions. I couldn't be part of that. I'm leaving town, but I'm leaving this letter as insurance in case something happens to Washington." The letter was dated March 28, 1984, just 6 days before Samuel Washington disappeared. "Murphy tried to warn him," Santos said, her voice filled with grim understanding. But it was too late. Marcus found another document in the folder, a handwritten note from Samuel, dated April 1, 1984. "If something happens to me, the person reading this should know that I never intended to abandon my students. I've tried to document everything, to create a record that will outlast whatever they have planned for me. The children at Jefferson Elementary deserve better than what this system has given them. They deserve teachers who will fight for them, administrators who will protect them, and a community that will believe in them. I pray that someday, someone will continue the work I started." Marcus felt tears burning his eyes as he finished reading. Samuel Washington had known he was in danger, had known that powerful people wanted him silenced. But even facing that threat, his last thoughts had been for his students. "We need to get this evidence to the FBI," Santos said. "The real FBI this time." Marcus nodded, but his attention had been caught by something else in the box, a manila envelope marked for Marcus Williams. With shaking hands, he opened the envelope and found a single sheet of paper covered in Samuel's familiar handwriting. "Marcus, if you're reading this, then you've grown up to be the man I always knew you could be. You were special, son, even when you couldn't see it yourself. You had a fire in you, a determination to fight against unfairness wherever you found it. I hope that fire still burns. The work we started together in 3rd grade isn't finished. These children still need someone to believe in them, to fight for them, to show them that they can be more than what the world expects. I pray that you'll continue that work, not because you have to, but because you understand how much it matters. Be strong, be brave, be the teacher these children need, even if you're not standing in front of a classroom." With love and pride, Samuel Washington Marcus sank onto one of the concrete benches, the letter clutched in his hands. After 20 years, Samuel Washington had reached out from the grave to remind him why they were fighting this battle. "Marcus," Santos's voice seemed to come from far away. "We need to go. If someone else knows about this place." Marcus looked up to find Santos standing in the doorway, her expression tense. "What is it?" "I heard something upstairs. We're not alone in the building." As if summoned by her words, they heard the sound of footsteps in the hallway above them, moving with purpose toward the basement stairs. Marcus quickly grabbed the most important files, the harassment documentation, Murphy's confession, Samuel's final letter. Santos helped him stuff the papers into a bag as the footsteps grew closer. "Is there another way out of here?" Santos whispered. Marcus thought frantically about the building's layout. "Emergency exit at the far end of the basement, but we'll have to get past whoever's coming down those stairs." The footsteps had reached the basement level and were moving in their direction. Santos drew her service weapon and motioned for Marcus to stay behind her. "Cleveland Police," she called out. "Identify yourself." The footsteps stopped. Then a voice Marcus didn't recognize called back. "Building security. Heard reports of a break-in." Santos and Marcus exchanged glances. The school district didn't employ night security at Jefferson Elementary. "We're leaving," Santos called out. "Don't do anything stupid." They moved quickly toward the emergency exit, Marcus clutching the bag of evidence. Behind them, they could hear multiple sets of footsteps now, and voices discussing how to handle the situation. The emergency exit was locked from the inside, but Santos managed to force it open. They emerged into the school's rear parking lot just as the first of their pursuers reached the basement hallway. "Move," Santos said, pushing Marcus toward her car. As they drove away from Jefferson Elementary, Marcus looked back to see several men emerging from the building. In the darkness, he couldn't make out their faces, but their purpose was clear. They had come to retrieve Samuel Washington's evidence, to bury the truth once and for all. But they were 20 years too late. The truth was already free, and Marcus Williams intended to make sure it reached the light of day. The reckoning FBI Special Agent Rebecca Torres had seen a lot of cold cases in her 15 years with the Bureau, but the Samuel Washington file was unlike anything she'd encountered. The evidence Marcus and Detective Santos had brought to her downtown office painted a picture of systematic corruption that reached deep into Cleveland's power structure. "This is substantial," Torres said, spreading the documents across her desk. "Financial records, photographic evidence, witness statements, and this confession from David Murphy is particularly damning." Marcus watched as the federal agent examined each piece of evidence with professional thoroughness. After 3 days of reviewing the materials, Torres had called them in for an update. "We've been able to corroborate much of what Mr. Washington documented," Torres continued. "Robert Kellerman did receive payments from several contractors seeking school district business. Detective Bradley was investigated by Internal Affairs multiple times for excessive force, though the complaints were always buried. And David Murphy, we found him." Santos leaned forward. "Found him where?" "Albuquerque, New Mexico. He's been living under an assumed name for 20 years, but facial recognition software matched him to his old driver's license photo. He's agreed to cooperate fully in exchange for immunity." Marcus felt his heart race. "What did he tell you?" Torres opened a thick folder. Murphy confirmed everything in his confession letter and more. He was hired by Kellerman and a group of school board members to discourage Samuel Washington from continuing his community outreach work. The harassment escalated when Washington refused to be intimidated. "What about the fake FBI agents?" "That's where it gets interesting. Murphy says they weren't fake. They were real federal agents, but they were working off the books. Apparently, there was a faction within the Bureau that was convinced civil rights activists were being influenced by communist agitators. These agents were conducting unauthorized surveillance and harassment campaigns." Marcus shook his head in disbelief. "So Samuel was telling the truth about everything?" "Unfortunately, yes. And according to Murphy, when it became clear that Washington wasn't going to back down, wasn't going to leave quietly, the decision was made to escalate the situation permanently." The room fell silent. Finally, Santos asked the question they were all thinking. "What happened to Samuel Washington?" Torres was quiet for a long moment. "Murphy says he wasn't present for the final confrontation, but he was told that Washington was killed and his body disposed of. The official story about him leaving town voluntarily was created to cover up the murder." Marcus felt a surge of rage and grief. After 20 years, he finally had confirmation of what he'd always suspected in his heart. Samuel Washington hadn't abandoned his students. He'd been murdered for trying to help them. "Who did it?" Marcus asked, his voice tight with emotion. According to Murphy, the actual killing was carried out by Bradley and 2 other men, a school district security guard named Frank Russo and a private investigator named Carl Hendricks. All 3 are dead now, but Murphy provided enough detail that we're confident in his account. Torres turned to another section of her file. "But here's the thing, Mr. Williams. The people who ordered Washington's murder, some of them are still alive." She pulled out a photograph that made Marcus's blood run cold. It showed a group of men in suits standing outside Cleveland City Hall, dated 1983. In the center was a younger version of someone Marcus recognized. "Thomas Morrison," Torres said. "Patricia Morrison's son. He was involved in his mother's political activities back then, and according to Murphy, he was one of the key organizers of the conspiracy against Washington. Today, he's a federal judge in the Northern District of Ohio." Marcus stared at the photograph. Judge Thomas Morrison had sworn him in as principal of Jefferson Elementary just 6 months ago. They'd shaken hands, exchanged pleasantries about improving educational opportunities for Cleveland's children. All the while, Morrison had known exactly what had happened to Samuel Washington. "We're going to arrest Morrison tomorrow morning," Torres said. "Along with 2 other surviving conspirators, former city councilman Richard Blake and retired school superintendent Harold Vance. All 3 will be charged with conspiracy to commit murder and civil rights violations." As they left the FBI office, Marcus felt a mixture of vindication and sorrow. Justice was finally coming for Samuel Washington, but it had taken 20 years, and the man himself would never see it. Truth and reconciliation. The arrests made headlines across Cleveland and beyond. Federal judge charged in 1984, murder of black teacher. Cold case exposes decades-old conspiracy. FBI uncovers cover-up in educator's death. Marcus stood in the principal's office at Jefferson Elementary, reading the morning papers with a mixture of satisfaction and melancholy. Through his window he could see news vans lining the street, reporters trying to get statements from anyone connected to the school. Detective Santos knocked on his door and entered, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "How are you holding up?" "I keep thinking about all the children Samuel could have helped if he'd lived," Marcus said. "All the lives that could have been changed. He did change lives. He changed yours, and look what you've accomplished. You're carrying on his work." Marcus nodded, but his attention was caught by movement in the hallway. A small group of elderly African-American women was walking toward his office, led by someone he recognized, Mrs. Ruth Henderson from Mount Calvary Baptist Church. "Mr. Williams," Mrs. Henderson said as she entered the office, "we wanted to thank you." Behind her were 5 other women, all in their 70s and 80s, all carrying themselves with the dignity of those who had lived through decades of struggle and change. "These ladies were all teachers here at Jefferson in 1984, Mrs. Henderson explained. "We all knew Samuel, and we all knew something terrible had happened to him, but we were too frightened to speak up back then." One of the women, a tiny lady with silver hair and bright eyes, stepped forward. "I'm Dorothy Johnson. I taught 2nd grade when Samuel was here. That man was a saint, Mr. Williams. He saw potential in every single child who walked through these doors." Another woman spoke up. "I'm Margaret Davis, 4th grade. Samuel used to stay after school every day, tutoring children whose parents worked late. He never asked for extra pay, never complained about the long hours. He just believed those children deserved every chance to succeed." Marcus felt tears welling up in his eyes as he listened to their memories of Samuel Washington. These women had carried the truth for 20 years, waiting for someone brave enough to bring it to light. "There's something else," Mrs. Henderson said. "We've been talking, and we want to do something to honor Samuel's memory. We want to establish a scholarship fund in his name to help Jefferson Elementary students attend college. We've already raised $15,000, Dorothy Johnson added, "and the school district has agreed to match whatever we collect." Marcus was overwhelmed. "Ladies, that's exactly what Samuel would have wanted." As the women left, Marcus turned to Santos. "I need to visit someone." An hour later they stood in Riverside Cemetery, at a small headstone marked simply, "Samuel Washington, 1952-1984, beloved teacher." Someone had placed fresh flowers on the grave, daisies and sunflowers, the kind a child might pick. Marcus knelt beside the headstone and placed his hand on the sun-warmed granite. "We did it, Mr. Washington. We found the truth. The people who hurt you are going to pay for what they did." Santos stood quietly nearby, understanding that this was a private moment between teacher and student, separated by death but connected by something stronger than time. "I'm going to keep fighting for these kids," Marcus said softly, "just like you taught me. I'm going to make sure every child at Jefferson Elementary knows they can be anything they want to be, that someone believes in them, that their dreams matter." A warm breeze stirred the trees around the cemetery, and Marcus could almost hear Samuel Washington's voice on the wind. "Be strong, be brave, be the teacher these children need." Epilogue. Legacy. 5 years later, Marcus Williams stood in the auditorium of Jefferson Elementary, watching the latest group of 5th graders receive their graduation certificates. The ceremony had become an annual tradition, a way of honoring the students' transition to middle school and celebrating their achievements. But this year was special. This year they were also dedicating the newly renovated library as the Samuel Washington Learning Center. Dr. Eleanor Hayes, now 87 but still sharp as ever, sat in the front row, beaming with pride. Detective Santos was there with her family, having become something of a school mascot since helping solve the Washington case. Father O'Brien sat with the retired teachers who had known Samuel, all of them wiping away tears as Marcus spoke about the man who had changed so many lives. Samuel Washington believed that every child has unlimited potential, Marcus told the assembled crowd. He believed that education is the great equalizer, that knowledge is power, and that teachers have a sacred duty to see the best in every student who walks through their doors. The Samuel Washington Scholarship Fund had grown to over $200,000, providing college assistance to dozens of Jefferson Elementary graduates. More importantly, the school itself had been transformed. Test scores were up, college enrollment among graduates had tripled, and the building buzzed with the energy of children who knew they were valued and supported. But perhaps the most meaningful change was harder to quantify. It was visible in the way teachers interacted with students, in the way parents engaged with their children's education, in the way the community had rallied around the school that Samuel Washington had died trying to improve. Judge Thomas Morrison had been sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Richard Blake had received 10 years, and Harold Vance had died of a heart attack before his trial began. The corruption that had festered in Cleveland's educational and political systems for decades had been exposed and purged. As the ceremony concluded and families gathered for refreshments, Marcus noticed a young boy standing alone near the back of the auditorium. The child looked familiar. Marcus recognized him as Jamal Thompson, a third grader who had been having behavior problems in class. Marcus approached the boy, who was staring up at the large portrait of Samuel Washington that now hung prominently in the school's main hallway. "What do you think of our library dedication, Jamal?" The boy looked up at Marcus with serious eyes. "My grandma says Mr. Washington was a hero." "Your grandmother is right. What makes someone a hero, do you think?" Jamal considered this carefully. "Someone who helps other people even when it's hard?" Marcus smiled. "That's exactly right. And you know what? You can be a hero too, just by working hard in school and believing in yourself." "Really?" "Really. Mr. Washington believed that every student at Jefferson Elementary could do great things. That includes you, Jamal." As the boy ran off to find his family, Marcus felt a familiar presence beside him. He turned to see Father O'Brien, who had been watching the interaction with a knowing smile. "He would be proud, you know," the priest said. "Samuel?" "Yes. You've become exactly the kind of educator he knew you could be. You're not just teaching these children facts and figures. You're teaching them to believe in themselves." Marcus looked around the transformed school, at the children laughing with their families, at the teachers who now approached their work with renewed purpose and passion. Samuel Washington's dream had finally been realized, but it had taken 20 years and a community's determination to see it through. "Father," Marcus said, "do you think Samuel knew? When he was hiding that evidence, when he was writing that letter to me, do you think he knew we'd eventually find it?" Father O'Brien was quiet for a moment, watching the children play in the hallway where their teacher had once walked. "I think Samuel Washington had faith, Marcus. Faith that the truth would eventually come to light. Faith that his students would grow up to carry on his work. Faith that love is stronger than hate and hope is stronger than fear." As the evening wound down and the families departed, Marcus made one final walk through the Samuel Washington Learning Center. The shelves were filled with books that would open young minds to new possibilities. The computers would connect students to a world of knowledge and opportunity. The comfortable reading nooks would provide quiet spaces for children to discover the joy of learning. On the wall near the main entrance, a bronze plaque bore Samuel Washington's words, "Every child has unlimited potential. Our job is to help them discover it." Marcus turned off the lights and locked the door, but he knew the real memorial to Samuel Washington wasn't contained in any building. It lived in the hearts and minds of every student who had been inspired to reach higher, dream bigger, and believe that their lives mattered. The truth had finally set them all free, and Samuel Washington's legacy would continue for generations to come. 20 years after a good man disappeared for trying to help children succeed, his dream had finally come true. And in the halls of Jefferson Elementary, his spirit lived on in every lesson taught with love, every student encouraged to persevere, and every young mind open to the possibility that they could change the world. The fight for justice had ended, but the fight for hope would continue forever. If this story touched your heart, hit that like button and subscribe for more mystery and redemption stories that will move you.